Quisiera ahora invitar a Toby Brzoznowski. Toby viene de Estados Unidos, es cofundador de Yamasoft y él nos va a hablar sobre cómo resolver el diseño de la cadena de suministro, un desafío estratégico y prioritario de los retailers. Toby, por favor.
Thank you. All right. Okay. So one job will be to try to keep us from going too far beyond schedule. My other job is to really start to introduce the more sexy part of retail, which is supply chain. All right. Supply chain is really, I think, probably the most sexy and high fashion part of everything that we do. So what I want to do today is really talk a little bit more about the evolving role of design, supply chain design, within the overall supply chain strategy. And so, with that, we're going to get going and get this going. But I wanted to say one other thing, which was Diana, our first presentation. I wanted to let her know that where I come from in Ann Arbor, Michigan, I actually have an orange gym and fitness center co-located with my grocery store. So, that is, the way that we're going is change, and disruption is going to be the way of the future. So, with that said, the first thing I want to do is kind of highlight one thing that has become really evident as we work with hundreds and hundreds of customers around the globe who deal with supply chain issues and supply chain challenges. The traditional role of people in supply chain has been in execution, has been helping to make sure that shipments go out the door, that the orders get filled, that your inventory is stocked, right? So execution and planning was really the role of the people who ran the supply chain. But there's been this emerging trend, which is that great planning and execution can't overcome bad design. And the one thing that you see over and over again is that as companies evolve and as they grow, and as the market changes, companies are basically sitting there with supply chains that they had put together over time, and those supply chains may not be anywhere near ready for the new changes that are happening. So to kind of illustrate this point of great planning and execution can't overcome bad design, I have a picture for you. All right. This is bad design, and I really don't care how well you try to execute. It's going to be uncomfortable. There is a problem when you see the way in which a lot of companies' supply chains are designed. There's only so good you can make it, and the next level of change is going to come based on how you redesign things. And those companies that can redesign faster and smarter are the ones that are going to be ahead. So, with that said, the first thing that I want to say is that running a supply chain isn't easy. And so, for those of you who are involved in your company's supply chain operations and management, I'm not telling you something you don't know. And for those of you who aren't, the next time you see one of your colleagues who works in supply chain walking down the hall, just stop and give them a hug, because they have a really tough job. And the problem is it's only getting worse. And the reason it's getting worse is partly because of what you heard from the first two presenters. And that is that things are changing, and things are changing rapidly. And supply chains are complex enough to begin with. There's literally moving parts that you have to deal with. And there's multiple echelons, and there's suppliers all over the globe. And there's customers all over the place that are expecting their goods on time and at the right price. And to really coordinate all that stuff is an incredible challenge. And then you add on top of that the fact that volatility and change is happening at a pace that you've never seen before in this industry. And I think that when you think about volatility and you think about change and risk, most often people associate that with things that are out of your control. Like, for instance, earthquakes and floods and tsunamis and hurricanes. At one point I was talking about 3 weeks ago at Gartner's annual supply chain conference in Europe, and at that time there were 3 hurricanes in the Caribbean all at the same time, right? So the point was really obvious for folks. But there's other things that are also outside of people's control, like, for instance, changing demand and changing customer expectations and where that demand is actually occurring. There's different regulations that are starting to come on all the time. With the new administration, and I don't want to say his name, in the U.S., some of the things that are being promised are extra regulations and new taxes and duties for imports. You saw Canada's Prime Minister, the second that they said that they were going to put this new 300% increase on airplanes that were being purchased from Canada. Then Canada responded and saying, we're no longer going to buy anything from Boeing. We're going to go elsewhere. And so these wars are coming up. But along the way, you have fuel changes and currency fluctuations. It's not just things that are outside of your control, but companies do things to themselves to make things more complicated. Like, for instance, Walmart's acquisition of Jet.com or Bonobos, Michael Kors' acquisition of Jimmy Choo. You see acquisitions, you see new ways of doing business. You want to go after other markets, and so you decide that one version of this product isn't enough. You have to have 25 different SKUs, different versions of that same product. And it's not enough to just have a new product once a year. You have to now introduce things every 3 months or every 4 months and then phase those out. So all of that volatility and change, it basically leads to a bunch of questions that somebody in your company has to answer. And that's primarily the supply chain people. They have to figure out things like, what is the right structure of the supply chain? Do I have enough capacity? Where should my facilities be? Who should source the demand that's coming in from these different customer locations? There's just things like, how do I flow products through the network to get me my lowest cost or to get me something that's actually profitable? Who do I source from? Do I source locally like I used to do? Or do I need to go out into low-cost countries now for certain items? And if I do bring in those low-cost countries, is it actually going to be profitable for me or not? There's questions about where do you stock inventory? How much do you need? What kind of service should you actually promise to your customers? And so what we've found over and over again is that the companies that are leaders in their industry, in their space, have come up with ways to answer these questions faster, smarter, and now more frequently than their competitors. And so as a software provider, which is my role leading LlamaSoft, what we're trying to do is figure out, well, how do people make those decisions? What do they need from a technology perspective to help them make decisions and make these things that are smarter, more frequent, faster than their competitors? And so one of the things that we really started to look to do was, what are the systems that people use today? And when you see what's out there, you start to see what capabilities people have, but you also start to see the gaps. You start to see what's missing. And so one of the ways that I've tried to analyze this is to look at what Gartner, again, one of the more respected analyst groups out there, has put together as a framework to define the different systems that are supporting the supply chain management folks. And the way that these things are structured and the way they lay it out is 3 levels. The first level that they talk about in this PACE model, that they call it, is there's a system of record, okay? The system of record is basically, think of it as your ERP systems, your MRP systems, your order management systems, the area where all of the information about your products and your customers and your suppliers and your shipments and all that stuff is located, right? You have these systems in place that are often extremely expensive. They probably spent tens of millions of dollars to put them in place. And if you're like most companies, you don't have a single system, you have multiple systems, and they're in different formats and structures. And the more acquisitions you do, the more other systems come into play that you have to figure out how to integrate. And so the IT folks are busy managing all of these systems of record. The main purpose of them is to help you standardize processes, standardize naming conventions, standardize where you get your information, where you store that information, where you record it, right? It helps you basically become a little bit more stable and help integrate all of the different moving parts throughout the operation. Those systems of record by themselves don't give you much of a competitive advantage. They just basically help you make sure that everything is happening. Now, the next level is the first level where you can start to say, maybe use a little bit of some of the business processes that you have that are maybe unique or different, that help you differentiate from your competitors. Maybe ways in which you decide to fulfill your orders, or the ways in which you route your trucks to get better utilization of your assets, or the ways in which you decide to stock your inventory, or the service that you provide. These are called the systems of differentiation. And the systems of differentiation are out there to be a little bit more configurable, to allow for some agility, to give you a little bit more of this competitive advantage. And the thing is that what we find is most of the companies out there that provide systems of differentiation, these software-driven products, some call them planning products, are usually provided by the same companies that are providing you with these big, giant systems of record. And one of the challenges you find in both areas here is with the systems of record, it's hard to have a single unified environment where all that data exists. And because they're so huge and because they're so cumbersome to install and implement, they don't change very often. They have decades of lifespan. And the systems of differentiated, these planning systems that are provided from these solutions also are massive, and they take a long time to implement, and they're not very agile. And this is one of the biggest problems, is that if the business is changing, how do you keep up with that change? And really, how do you identify what you should be doing next? And this is where this third level comes in, which is called the system of innovation. And in Gartner's terms, what they say about this is, this is where you can, a tool or a technology or an application that allows you to experiment, to try new things, right? To say, all right, what if I did this instead of this? Or what if we, instead of offering same-day service for all of our products, what if we only offered it in certain markets? What if we decided to offer better service in certain places? What is that going to cost us? How much inventory is going to increase, or our transportation costs going to increase? And so this is basically this digital environment to allow you to experiment, to try new things, to disrupt, to come up with a new idea that might be that breakthrough that you need. And so the thing about these three different systems is that those tools tend to be provided by different solution providers. Honestly, that's where we've lived as a company for the last 15 years since we've been in business. We've been providing companies with the ability to create these digital models of their supply chain to come up with new ideas, to optimize the way in which it's currently operating, to simulate new strategies. The challenge has been then, once you come up with that new idea, how do you best put that to work for you and execute on it? Because if you come up with a new idea, but it takes you a year and a half to implement the change, is it really worth it, right? The business has probably changed again, and you haven't gotten the value. And so it's where we've seen our customers pulling our solutions down into this area of system of differentiation as well, to say, hey, look, I need something that gives me a new answer, but then I can flexibly and easily deploy as well, so that I'm keeping up with the pace of change. Because the other thing that Gartner says in this model is, the more change that you have, right, the more change, the more volatility, the more risk that is introduced into the market, into your operations, the more you need to rely on this top level, and the less important or the less critical this bottom level is. So where do you need to focus your capabilities, right? The more disruption, the more change, the more you have to continuously innovate in order to keep up, right? It's kind of obvious, but the thing about it is, and this is the other part that, again, in this model that Gartner talks about a lot now, is this thing that they call the bimodal supply chain, right? So it's just a fancy term that says that you have to run the business that you have today, and you have to be good at that. That's mode one, right? The traditional mode. But at the same time, you have to be good at reinventing yourself, reinventing the way in which you do business to keep up with new technologies, new disruptive ways of doing business, right? New customer demand, new market conditions, new regulations. It's like you have to fly the plane, but you have to, at the same time that you're flying it, be redesigning it and recreating. It's not an easy thing to do, right? And so the real challenge for companies is to come up with a mechanism and a way to do both of these and do both of them well. The other kind of interesting thing about this is, if you look at the perceived and actual return on investment, you're investing tens of millions of dollars on this bottom level to run the existing supply chain, but you're not getting a big return on that. You're spending a lot of money on it, and it's critical. You have to run the supply chain that you have, but the breakthrough, the thing that's going to identify the next 10 or 15 or 20 or $100 million of cost savings or service breakthroughs is going to come from the other end, where you're spending a heck of a lot less money, and most companies aren't anywhere near investing at the level that they potentially need to. And so when you put all this together, I think what you see is you've got all these three different systems. You have to run both the supply chain that you have, and you have to reinvent yourself. The definitions that we use for these things are execution, planning, design. Execution and planning has been in the vernacular of the supply chain space for decades and decades. Design is something really new, right? But design, like I said, and because of market conditions, is becoming more and more critical and more important. And so when you look at that, what you say is, all right, so what is supply chain design really, right? And so the definition of design in the dictionary is, to essentially create a model of something to be executed, right? So in this case, what we're talking about is, we're creating a digital model of your operations, right? Where are all of your sites? Where are all of your facilities? Where are all of your suppliers and all of your customers? And what demand is occurring at that customer base? What are the lead times for your suppliers? Where are they located? What kind of capacity and capabilities do they have? How do I flow products through the network? In other words, sourcing policies about when I get an order, who sources it? Is it my distribution center? Is it a store? Is it direct from a factory, right? When I need to replenish inventory, where do I get it from? Buying behaviors of, if I buy in bigger bulks and bigger quantities, I get a better discount. But is that the right thing to do? So you have to have all of these different elements, these costs and policies within this digital model. And once you have that, now you have the ability to ask all kinds of questions and use more advanced analytics and solvers to solve these things. So what you find is, when you get these digital models built, now you have things like optimization solvers to optimize the network structure, or multi-echelon inventory optimization solvers to optimize based on demand, based on the variability of demand and variability throughout your supply chain. Where should you be stocking each product to achieve the service targets that you have? There's product flow path optimization to get you your lowest cost to serve. There are optimizations around truck routing, right? If I have all of these orders that I have to replenish on a daily basis, but I only have 5 trucks available to me at this warehouse, how do I most efficiently utilize that capacity that I have? Or do I need more capacity, right? Asset optimization. You have all these different techniques that are available to you. Those are the things that we as a company have been building in to this technology, so that when you have these models, you have the ability to ask the what if, so that when you do need to make a decision, you've already tested it out, and you have a pretty good sense of what's going to happen if you implement that change. Because that's the other thing here. It's not just cost saved, but it's also cost avoided, right? How many times have you made a decision or seen a decision made in the company, and you implemented it only to find 3 to 6 months later that it was a really bad idea? And now you're stuck because you've invested a ton of money here. And do you just keep going? Do you pull the plug? Do you start over? Right? And so if you can do that in a digital environment and test this out through simulation, you're in much better shape to avoid those costly mistakes. All right, so that is supply chain design. This afternoon, I was invited to sit in on a couple of these workshops and panel discussions, and specifically on the technology piece around supply chain. And in there, I want to go through actual use cases that we've seen our customers use. We've been working with Walmart for quite a few years now, as well as many other retailers. And what you find is there's a lot of lessons learned along the way. You do make mistakes, but you learn from them. And when you start to do this hundreds and hundreds of times, you start to find out what are the best practices. And those are some of the things that I really want to keep exploring and sharing with you guys. What we do find is the companies that have said supply chain design is as important as planning and execution, and they've created these centers of excellence, these teams who are focused on continuous design and redesign and experimentation, right? Those companies are getting enormous returns. And so we did a survey of our customer base that had over 500 respondents, and we averaged out all of those different cost savings that they had achieved across a number of different areas. So from inventory cost to production to transportation and sourcing costs, handling costs and everything. And what you found is on average, it was around a 10% cost savings that they were achieving. And when you think about the end-to-end, the costs of running a supply chain, and on average it's 10, but you're going as far as 20, 30, in some cases 40% cost savings identified. That's a real serious return that you can bring back to the business, and you can use that money elsewhere. You can use that money to innovate. We did a third-party study that we had a major university in the U.S. conduct for us, and they went out again to companies who had created these supply chain design centers of excellence. And what they found was that over 70% of the companies that had this team in place had identified at least $10 million of annual cost savings, and they were finding that year over year as additional savings. And 30% of those, it was 50% or more, $50 million or more in cost savings. So it's massive return. So when you have that kind of return on investment, and you're keeping up with your competitors, that's what gives you this competitive advantage. So from our side as a company, and I'm just going to take like a minute to describe who we are, it's the reason why we've been the fastest growing software company in the supply chain space in North America for the last 6 years. It's really luck more than anything, in that we were the right place at the right time. We were coming into the market as the entire global financial markets crashed. And people were trying to figure out, what do we do, right? How do we reduce cost? How do we eliminate all of this excess capacity? There's no more demand for our products. What do we do? And then they came out of that and they realized, the world didn't end, and now people are buying things again, and they have all this pent-up need to buy more products. So we've supported, since that time, it's over 2,000 global initiatives and have over 700 customers that have been doing this. And what you find is those companies that are doing this are really the global leaders. So when you look at those, what are the most envied supply chains, or the top 25 globally or by industry, those tend to be the guys that are doing this, and they're doing it consistently, right? Because they can execute what they have, but they're continuously looking at ways to make it better. And so you see this across a lot of industries, and it's really something that, from a retail perspective, you see happening more and more. And actually, the highest growth area within our business for the last 3 years in a row has been retail. And part of the reason is that big, thing out there that a lot of people try to ignore or don't want to talk about because it gives them cold sweats, and that's Amazon, right? And what do you do about this impending threat? And so, there are a lot of different strategies that you have to deploy, and you have to test out new ideas and see if those are going to work for you. And so you see the experience that these guys are starting to gain with leveraging something that they have as a competitive advantage, like stores in different markets, or like different supplier relationships than some of the e-commerce only environments. And they also have relationships with a lot of these guys, which are their suppliers, right? And these guys have also been doing supply chain design actually longer in many cases than the retailers. And so they're starting to learn from the Unilevers and the Procter & Gambles and all the PepsiCos of the world as to what are some best practices. And they're starting to collaborate more on the design of their operations. They're starting to find new ways to operate because they have tighter relationships and longer standing relationships in these markets than a lot of their e-commerce only competitors have. So with that, I really want to wrap up and say, the idea basically being, when you think about running an operation, and specifically going after some of these changes that are happening in the market, it's not enough to just say, hey, how do I execute better? And if I can get that truck filled up with another 5%, is that going to give me the next return? It's really about how do I potentially destroy the supply chain that I have and rebuild something that's stronger. Right? So that's my story today, and I appreciate the time. Thank you.